Started. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia. Today, he is the inaugural Jaroslawski Democracy Chair at Ryerson University. I was saying to him before that we've been planning this for a while, and I'm very much looking forward to his talk today titled Polarization, Inequality and Democracy. With that, we could go on, but what I'll do is I'll just pass it over to you to have a great talk and hopefully some interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Tamsin, and thanks to everyone who's logged on this morning. I want to thank Tamsin for inviting me to join the conference and the session, and not least her patience. As she said, this has been in the making for a while. I'm going to try to speak for about 20 minutes, maybe even less, for one basic reason, which is that I'm very much an outsider to this field of media and communication studies. It's not an area that I focus my research on, but I've always been intrigued by it, and I've sort of read around it. And what I wanted to do today was to use the occasion for me to try to learn from you about how to think about the relationship between media and democracy in the context particularly of the last decade in historical perspective, and what a phenomenon that many political scientists call democratic backsliding. And I'll explain in a moment what that particular term means, and what role different types of media play in that, and how significant they are or not. So this is really a presentation where maybe some of the material on democratic backsliding and those sort of debates in political science may be less familiar, versus probably what I have to say about the media is very elementary. So you'll have to apologize. I apologize in advance about that. But basically sort of highlighting some fundamental things we've learned, and then maybe putting these two areas of research and inquiry together might provoke a discussion. So I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and criticisms. So with that, let me start. Democratic backsliding. The term refers to the erosion in the norms, institutions, and practices that we associate with democratic governance. So we think of sort of emblematic figures in the last decade. Donald Trump obviously comes to mind. People like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, even Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom. So these are the election of leaders, often populist leaders of various kinds, and they and when we associate them, we associate the rise with some kind of crisis in our democratic systems. What is backsliding in particular? When we normally think about the breakdown of democracy, we think about classic instances of military coups, for instance, right? So the army steps in, the soldiers enter the main square, and the generals take over. Or we may think that a democracy has broken down because one of the most important institutions of a democracy, its mechanism of accountability, is an election. And during an election, even a civilian government, a party in power, an incumbent, might stuff the ballot box and steal the election on polling day. So these are sort of classic examples of democratic breakdown. We have a vast literature on this, and that looks at this over the 20th century. Patterns of how democracies are formed, how they're transitioned from authoritarian regimes to democratic ones, and then how they break down. In the last decade and a half, though, we've seen this new phenomenon called democratic backsliding. And what's different about democratic backsliding is that, unlike a classic military coup, where the army and the soldiers step in and wrest power from the civilian authority, this erosion that we see is often by civilian governments, political leaders who are elected into power. And once they're in power, they begin to subvert the institutions from within, right? So this is sort of a very different type of erosion. So that's the first aspect that's quite different. The second is that the way in which these democracies erode is quite incremental. It's quite piecemeal. And so we might not see it happening right away. It's something that sort of accumulates over time until at some point it may even tip into a military coup. But often it never even gets to that, right? So if you think about, I mean, the United States is the most recent instance, which we thought could have led to a kind of a classic breakdown if the mobilization on January 6th had been successful. But even though that was averted, there was of course a severe corrosion of norms and practices within that democratic system. So in these ways, democratic backsliding is a different phenomenon, and a lot of political scientists who are studying it are trying to grapple about how you study it, what are the indicators, and how it relates to classic breakdown. This graph that I've kind of popped up here is by the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden. It's one of the best surveys in the world. Take all of these surveys with a pinch of salt, obviously, but it's a very fine-grained survey with lots of different indicators and instruments. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side, that's a number of countries that are either advancing towards liberal democracy, so they look at a different set of indicators, or regressing away from that sort of ideal. And that one on the left side is a number of countries. So you see in 2017, and that red line now will have surpassed the green line, the number of countries that we consider liberal democracies has fallen below those that are not. If you weight the number of countries that are liberal democracies in the world by population, and so that's the graph on the right, then of course we're in a different territory. And the reason for that is very clear. India in the classification since then is no longer, it's no longer called a liberal democracy if it was, and even some countries in Western Europe, and I'm not even sure the United States might no longer be classified as a straight liberal democracy or as a flawed democracy. So what are these forms? I've already talked a little bit about this. So instead of a coup d'etat, the sort of iceberg up on the upper left-hand side, what we have is an erosion from within by civilian leaders that are popularly elected and actually invoke the mandate to justify the ways in which they undermine checks and balances and the separation of powers, attack civil society, try to undermine the media, and so on. Instead of ballot rigging on election day itself, right, sort of stealing or stuffing ballot boxes, what you see is, this is the lower left-hand side iceberg, strategic manipulation of elections. So a classic instance is what happened in the US, and there are many other countries that do this, where you begin to cast doubt on the integrity of the electoral process. You begin to say that mail-in ballots are fraudulent. You begin to say that voter rolls are rigged, right? You tilt the terrain of contestation before the election to such a degree that either you help shape the outcome in terms of who's allowed to vote and who's not, or you cast so much doubt on the procedures that on election day, if the party that's trying to do that loses, they basically call into question the integrity of the outcome. And clearly that's what happened in the US, or tried to happen in the US. It was an attempt. It happens in many other places too. Another feature that I sort of hinted at, but it's worth sort of stressing, is what we call executive aggrandizement. This means that amongst the three branches of government, judiciary, legislature, executive, the executive office becomes ever more powerful, right? It accumulates power in its office, whether it's a presidency or a prime ministerial office. There's a lot of overreach of executive power. And the overreach happens in sort of two ways. One is that the power of the executive increases vis-a-vis the judiciary on the one hand, the legislature on the other. But the executive also begins to accumulate and exercise power in a way that begins to undermine independent public institutions. So you could think of a central bank, for instance, or the comptroller and auditor general in many countries. It also begins to question the integrity or undermine the independence of public institutions in civil society more generally. And so these are features, classic features of what we consider to be democratic backsliding. What are the causes of backsliding? This is a really vigorous debate. I'm going to highlight just three. One is democratic backsliding has been very strongly associated with growing socioeconomic inequalities that have grown across countries, I shouldn't say across the world within countries since the 1970s. The reason I caught myself there was that there has been depending on what surveys we look at, what data we look at, economists say there's been a narrowing of north-south inequalities, right, with the rise of China, India, other countries in the global south. So when you look at sort of global income distribution, there's been a somewhat of a leveling of global inequalities between countries in the last 40 years, 50 years. But within countries, as we know, except for very few, Brazil for a while until the rise of Bolsonaro, you see an expansion of inequality, and it's on a number of dimensions: income, wealth, are the two sort of classic indicators or factors. And what we see is growing precarity of labor, growing commodification of work and leisure in our societies. And so that growing social inequality is very important to understanding democratic backsliding, because the performance legitimacy, even of democratic regimes, rested on a relatively shared prosperity and rising social mobility over time. The so-called American dream of the 1950s and 60s, for at least those who were able to partake in that kind of phenomenon. And as we know, even that dream was very restricted in racial and ethnic terms. But what we see in the period of the post-1980s is a rapid increase in socioeconomic inequalities. This is something we all know. Second big factor that people look at is, in the wake of that growing socioeconomic inequality, we see reactionary backlashes, particularly of the sort of native ethnic populations of many countries. Of course, in North America, we can't say that so easily, because there are the indigenous peoples who were expropriated, whose lands were expropriated, and who were dispossessed far long time ago. But if you think about the sort of populist rise of part in the far right in Western Europe, you'll see sort of this argument about the real Poles, the real Hungarians, the real Americans, in Canada, even the real Canadians, vis-a-vis relatively newer immigrants, and of course in North America, even vis-a-vis the original inhabitants of these lands, the indigenous population, the indigenous nations. So you see the sort of rise of a reactionary backlash and a resurgent nationalism, where the focus of nationalism, even in countries that used to espouse a form of civic nationalism, that you belong to a nation, you are a citizen because you express a commitment to certain values and principles that were embodied in the Constitution. What we begin to see is a regression to a more ethnic form of nationalism, that you belong to this nation because you are a member of a people, and that people is defined in ethnic terms, whether it's a common language, a religion, and so on. And as a result of that, I mean, again, this is all probably fairly self-evident to everyone. You know, you see this growing social polarization. And the polarization happens on a number of dimensions. And what's very striking about the polarization is that the various cleavages in our society begin to become superimposed upon each other, right? So there is a class cleavage, there's an educational cleavage, those who went to university, those who did not. There is a sectoral cleavage, those who live in rural settings and small towns versus big cosmopolitan centers. There is often an ethnic cleavage between ethnic and racial minorities and the host or native population of many countries, right? And there's also, of course, a gendered dimension. And what you begin to see is this social polarization, which begins to make it harder and harder for people to identify with the other side. And our multiple overlapping identities that are sort of typical in any sort of complex modern society begin to break down, so that we no longer invoke many aspects of our identity that might be what they call cross-cutting, right? But they tend to sort of be superimposed upon each other. And so this is just, these are two prominent, the book I put up by Steph Haggard and Bob Kaufman is one of several that have been really advancing our understanding of how backsliding works, its causal determinants. So I finally get to the question of the media and modes of communication in our democracies and how it might fit into this story. So classic 19th century idea of the public sphere in modern representative democracies was that the public sphere was a constituent element of democratic life, right? This was a sphere in which citizens, and of course highly restricted definition of citizenry in the 19th century. But nonetheless, a public sphere in where citizens would engage in conversation, in debate, in discussion on matters of common concern, right? So could have very different points of view because they disagreed ideologically, intellectually, they held different class positions, they were persuaded politically by different perspectives. But this sort of idea that there was a conversation in common in which people took different positions, but the parameters of that conversation, of that discussion, were at least shared. That's a sort of standard image of the public sphere in the 19th century that emerges. You see it in the work of Jürgen Habermas, the structure of the public sphere, the restructuring of the public sphere. Standard critique, obviously, this public sphere was very exclusionary. It was very much dominated by men of higher class position, and so there's a rise of what we call counter publics or subaltern public spheres in many societies, right? And so you do see this sort of duality even within the public sphere, sort of vertical segmentation of the public sphere. But nonetheless, even there was a sort of sense that even in these counter publics or these subaltern public spheres, you would have a sort of commonality of discussion, of concern, and so on. So that's sort of a classic idea, obviously an ideal type that I've sketched out. I'll say one more thing about it. One of the things that's very striking about that public sphere, which actually gives rise to modern nationalism, as famously put forward by Benedict Anderson, is the idea that there's a simultaneity of exchange of information, right? Of comprehension, what he called homogeneous empty time. He associates this with the rise of print capitalism. And two vehicles that he looks at very closely are the novel and the newspaper. And the newspaper, I think, is the one that's really striking for maybe our discussion today, is the idea that you have newspapers which are printed at the same time, are delivered or available for reading in the morning at the same time. And everyone who is reading these newspapers is doing it at the same time, right? So this is this idea of a homogeneous empty time, of things happening at the same time. So community comes into being, comes into being because it's reading the news, but it's doing it literally at the same time, right? The morning paper or the evening paper. And so this is, again, a classic aspect of that original modern formation. So jumping from the 19th century to the last decade and the rise of new social media, what were these initial hopes? And again, everything I'm going to say here is self-evident and well-known, but just to kind of highlight some of the aspects of it. Early hopes of new social media, new digital technologies that would allow us to communicate outside of the mainstream mass media, that would help mobilize citizens in ways that they could do independently. It would so restore an agency, political agency to them through these new media technologies. It would help represent their interests that were often marginalized. And in doing so, it would expand the public sphere. And thirdly, as a result of those transformations, there might be more direct forms of public accountability. So this is an image from Egypt in 2011, before the fall of the Mubarak dictatorship. This was the early sort of idea of the Arabs. This was the early instantiation of these hopes in the Arab Spring and what became the color revolutions. It's why China clamped down very harshly on new digital technologies and social media, at least being used by citizens to mobilize, represent, and communicate concerns behind the great Chinese firewall. What have we seen, of course, in the last decade, including in testimony this week? The trends, of course, are far more complex and dark. I'll just highlight three. One, of course, as we know, there's a great deal of misinformation and active campaigns of political disinformation that are spread through these new media technologies and through social media platforms. There's an aspect of the new, the acceleration of time, sort of collapse of almost time and space because of these new digital technologies allows for instant communication. But that itself, although it leads to greater participation, you might say, and the speed of exchange, it actually has quite regressive effects on the quality of deliberation that takes place often in these sort of different platforms and channels. which actually reduces the possibility of accountability. And that's obviously a complicated realm. So in some ways, accountability might still be enhanced, but in other areas, it is reduced. And I think the third aspect that really I find quite striking is this demise of a common public sphere, right? Our time is now discontinuous. We can consume and produce information in a way which is very different from the sort of homogeneous empty time that Anderson talked about in the 19th century that gave the rise to the public sphere and modern nationalism, a deliberative commons. So you see a sort of decline of a commonality in this public sphere, a fragmentation and atomization. And we're still coming to grips with the consequences of that for our democracies. How does this then relate to sort of classic mainstream news media? So the backdrop to those new hopes, obviously, was a standard critique of the mainstream news media. And someone like Chomsky sort of articulated it very acutely, which is, there are many other critiques of this, I just highlight two. Sort of a twofold critique of it. One is that, well, what did the mainstream news media represent and who could write in it? There were very much gatekeepers of news and opinion. And what was the point of this gatekeeping? Well, in Chomsky's phrase, it was to manufacture consent in our democratic societies, to avoid contentious issues, to de-radicalize public opinion against the various inequalities and asymmetries of power and wealth and status in our societies. This is his account. But many would sort of share even a lesser version of that. And that was undergirded by a political economy that was clearly there to enhance corporate power, maintain certain social hierarchies, and to maintain a sort of class basis for the capitalist democracies that we live in. What's very striking is, as I think this is my last slide, as these deficits of the new social media platforms have come increasingly to light and our attention, this is now connecting back to this debate on democratic backsliding. One of the things we do see in democratic backsliding is as populist leaders begin to entrench executive power and use it to undermine both state institutions as well as organizations in civil society, you see an attack on civil liberties of various kinds. And one of the ones that's very striking is an attack on independent media organizations, right? So this is the classic instance of fake news. Trump tries to denigrate the integrity and basically undermine the integrity of the New York Times, saying they're simply peddling fake news. So you see a general attack on civil liberties in many countries and press freedom in particular. So this graph is from Freedom House. Again, you take these things with a pinch of salt, but there's a clear secular trend from 2005 to the present where press freedom in many democracies is declining. And of course, some countries that slope is far more severe and the regression is far worse. And especially of critical and investigative journalism. We still see a remarkable sort of reporting take place, even just this week. I'm losing now, I can't remember quite, it's not, you've got the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers and so on. You have all these independent news organizations that are trying to expose light on, tax evasion and various other sort of opaque areas of our global political economy. But generally, you see this sort of decline in civil liberties and media freedoms. You see an accelerated decline of print media organizations as advertising moves from sort of mainstream media to digital platforms. And so you see decline of newspapers, readership, except for a few of the sort of hallmark ones in many countries. This is especially damaging in local newspapers. There's story after story that we read about the local newspaper and many of our smaller towns or even smaller cities in many countries sort of falling, basically collapsing. They simply can't generate enough revenue and they've lost too much advertising money in order to be a going concern. So that sort of decline of the local newspaper has really deleterious effects on local democracy and public participation and at that level of our democracy. And a third aspect, as we know, is rising mass surveillance. States, of course, are using these new digital technologies. China is probably the most extreme example of this, but many other democracies are using it as well. If you think of the Pegasus expose. just in the last year, using these new digital technologies to spy basically on citizens. But even our private companies, and I'll probably end with this, Facebook is yet again in the news, are using various kinds of algorithms to basically accumulate information without our full or at least explicit and informed consent, and using it to basically pervert the types of exchanges that we have on these platforms, right? So whereas before you might have, in the classic sort of public sphere ideal type, you have an exchange of opinions that could be quite radically apart, you know, from conservative to socialist, there's at least a sort of commonality of information that might be available in the public sphere, and certain parameters of, or certain criteria that we would share of what is trustworthy, that we have some sort of norm of objectivity or impartiality in assessing various truth claims. A lot of that, of course, has been under assault, and that is something that's really come to our attention. So I think that's where I'll end there, and I look forward to comments, questions, criticisms, and really learning from you, because as I said, this is a new kind of area for me, and so I want to just take this opportunity to try to understand from those who really worked on these new technologies and the studies around them, how we might better understand the erosion we've seen in our democracies in light of transformations, you know, in the world of media and communications. So let me stop there.
Thank you. I will just say that I'll give people a couple of minutes to write questions in the chat, and then I'll either read them out or call on them to ask those questions. But I would like to start with a question, if that's okay. Well, it's sort of a comment question that maybe you can speak to. And actually your talk was very interesting and also related to our plenary speaker yesterday, who was Riyanka Singh. And she was talking about the public sphere and who's able to speak, who's not. How do you have action and change in the public sphere? She was talking specifically in relation to platforms such as social media, as one example, that she used the word amplification, so that social media amplifies certain perspectives in the public sphere. That is would namely be like a white male perspective that could or could not be saying these anti-democratic things on social media. So then I wondered if you could maybe had any idea or thought about how these platforms like social media and the media in general might in themselves be structured in an anti-democratic way, which leads to the amplification of these ideas to begin with. If that makes sense?
Yes, no, absolutely. So, I mean, that's just such an important question. I don't know what particular insight I'd have. I mean, I think one thing that strikes me is that I think we sort of think of this temporally, right? So when these new digital technologies were created and unveiled and people began to use them, I think initially what you see would be an expansion of the public sphere, right? Because suddenly everybody has the ability, the capacity to post views, comments, share opinion, and so on. So I think early on, I mean, I think that's why it was very striking, at least for those who study sort of democratization, these sort of transitions from autocracy to democracy and so on. The Arab Spring was a really important moment, right? Where you began to see the use of this new social media to circumvent all kinds of formal state controls on the mass media in many countries, right? So it was kind of destabilized that apparatus of control. And it still works in that way in many countries, as we know, right? You can have an official news bulletin, you can have a state or a government issuing its view of what happened, and then there will be somebody who's on the ground who has a camera and a phone, and they'll say, actually, this is what happened at this incident, right? So I think early on in that, I sort of think of it temporally. Early on, you see an expansion of the public sphere. You've probably seen an empowerment of voices that never had access to media instruments. But then because of the way, and I'm still learning this too, so I really look forward to those of you who study it more in depth, the way in which the algorithms are designed and utilized in these platforms begin to amplify, as you say, certain voices, and they tend to be, right, more sensationalist voices, more radical voices. We use the word clickbait, something that's going to grab our attention, right? So it's not sober, it's not nuanced. It is going to amplify certain types of voices. And it allows, of course, anything to be said until in the name of freedom of speech, right? So you begin to see a lot of sentiment, right, which can be a sort of hatred and systematic racism and misogyny of various kinds, xenophobia, all the things we've seen, suddenly being expressed, right, without any kind of filter or control. And then I think a third aspect that I find interesting, and sort of, I suppose we're all our own self-studies, right, as people have also talked about this, is that even, people have studied what are people willing to say in person? What are they willing to put on paper if they were to write a letter? What do they say if they're writing email, right? It becomes increasingly informal and spontaneous, these forms of exchange. And people begin to write in a way that perhaps is less deliberative, right? And the exchange of information and views is less deliberative. And I think that the technology itself, what makes us less careful in what we say and what we post. And this has to do something with, of course, it's the temporal aspect of these new technologies, right? The speed of communication. So how many times people tweet something and suddenly they take the tweet down because they did it in a very sort of hasty, impulsive way. How many times they put a post and they think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have posted that. There's something about the technology itself that, there's inadequate checks. And then because it happens so fast, not only is, I don't think it's a sort of neutral medium. I think that's what a lot of psychologists are beginning to tell us. It's not just that the medium itself is incredibly fast and instantaneous, but that it actually encourages us to be less deliberative in our own thought processes before we write, before we articulate, before we express. And I think that's part of that amplification, which not only amplifies certain voices and certain views, but in doing so, it also perhaps distorts them. Or, it kind of, whatever balance there might be in a set of views suddenly is bent out of shape, if that makes sense. Again, that's at least how I've sort of tried to understand it. And I've also noticed even myself, tweets things I would write on Twitter, I'm less likely to write on Facebook even, because there's something about the medium that encourages certain, a certain form of expression.
Thank you. So we have another question here in the chat. Akasua, she cannot use her microphone and things, so I'm going to read it. It's a sort of a two-part question. When you talked about socio-economic inequalities, does that include education? Could you speak a little bit about that? And then the second part is, I appreciate the idea of the public sphere, but what about the idea of digital divide where not everybody has access to social media? How does or could that affect democracy, and what could be done?
Right, no, two great questions. So the first one, the area that I have read more about has to do with tertiary education, higher education, right? Universities. And here, what's very striking is if you look at what happened in the United States, the rise of Trump, if you look at what happened in Britain, its decision to leave the European Union or Brexit, if you look at the mobilization of supporters for far-right parties in Western Europe, or even movements like, in France, the Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets jaunes, and so on. Sociologists who've studied this say one of the striking things about supporters of these new populist movements, particularly those on the center-right, is that the sociology of the supporters, initially the hypothesis was, well, this is a class phenomenon, and it is a class phenomenon. But there was an understanding that, well, those who are part of the traditional working class, let me rephrase that. Those who belong to households on sort of the lowest tier of the income distribution ladder, right, are the ones who are supporting this, because they've dealt with 30, 40 years of declines in public spending and attacks on the state with the rise of sort of neoliberal economic policies. What was really striking in certainly in the US and in the UK, so those are two areas I've studied a bit more closely. I think we're beginning to see this. We don't do exit poll studies in Canada. If we had, I think we might see something similar. Is what's striking is that certainly in the UK and the US, those who voted for Brexit and Trump were not in the lowest tiers of income distribution, right? They often were racialized minorities or ethnic communities of various kinds. They tended to be households where the average income may be 60, 70,000, but they were traditional working class. There was an erosion of security in their worlds, in their life worlds. There was obviously a changing sort of status differential with the rise of minorities in various positions. And one of the biggest divides was this educational divide. Did you go to university or not? So in the case of Brexit, a lot of people have said, if you look at all the different factors that we could study about who voted for Brexit, and I'm just putting aside whether it was a good or bad thing for a moment, right? But let's say for the moment, because there were some important arguments about, the recovery of sovereignty, and what I mean by that is saying, where does sovereignty lie, and was there enough deliberation within Parliament, for instance, on certain laws and how they're promulgated, legislated, and so on. What's really striking about Brexit is if you take all the different indicators of party ideology, of income, of where you live, whatever it is, the one that matters the most, it's not saying that those other factors don't matter, but the one that matters the most is, did you go to university or not? And I think we find something very similar in the US when it comes to those who voted for Trump. So the educational cleavage in our societies in terms of higher education is absolutely crucial to understanding backsliding, right? Particularly those that are supporting executives who are willing to attack public institutions and undermine checks and balances in the name of the people, in which the people, of course, is a very narrow, exclusive conception, right, of who belongs to the people. So that's the first question. I don't know if I can answer the one when it comes to maybe schooling. There, of course, I think the thing we're concerned about is, in different countries, is just simply public funding for primary and secondary education, right? And again, in this neoliberal era, we've seen many cuts and a decline in that. The second question, sorry, you have to remind me.
Sorry, I'll just, there's some movement in the chat, so I have to, what about the digital divide?
Yes.
So access to social media, access to this public sphere, how does or could that affect democracy, and what could be done?
I don't quite know how to answer that question. I mean, I suppose, I think there's sort of two aspects to it. One would be, simply sort of materially, technically, those who have access to broadband services, to wireless, to connectivity, right? So that's a divide, certainly, in many parts, particularly in rural areas. We read about that. And so that means that that's part of this wider sort of sectoral inequality we've seen that's been growing for the last 20, 30 years, right? It's part of a general decline of access to opportunities and services in many smaller towns and rural settings, right? So we see a general decline of public services, of infrastructure. So I think that, if I understand the question in that sense, the sort of infrastructural capacity of this new digital tech, doing these new digital platforms, that's something that is part of a piece of this wider sort of trend of inequality we see, of access, of inequalities of opportunity, and therefore inequalities of outcome. If it's a digital divide in this realm of, once you have access to these new digital platforms, is there a divide within them, right? Is there some kind of hierarchy or inequality of voice and a representation within these new communicative media? That I'm not sure how to quite answer. I mean, I think, again, it probably reflects back to the first question, but are there certain voices that are being amplified or not? So that's probably how I think about that. I think there's a new aspect, a new phenomenon that's happening, which I've been struck by. So you think about these sort of new digital platforms that are sort of emerging, right? Where sort of famous authors, for instance, I can't remember the name of the platform, you'll have to remind me, but some of them are having the sort of new newsletters in which they're basically monetizing a lot of their opinion and commentary, right? And so you begin to see within this new realm, I think, as you do anytime you have anything that's monetized, right, in a capitalist society, that you're getting a new hierarchy in this new digital world as well. So if the old mass media had certain voices that were allowed to speak and be represented and others that found it difficult, as we see the shift to the dominance of new digital technologies in social media, you also see, of course, a new hierarchy developing. And whether that reflects and reinforces the old, or whether it allows new voices that were denied opportunities in that old world to break through in the new, I think something we're probably still trying to study. But I have been struck by that aspect. So the people I follow who, really smart, informed people who I want to read what they're doing, and suddenly, in order to access their blogs and so on, you have to pay a commission. That's intellectual labor, so it should be compensated. But the amounts that are being involved here themselves create new class inequalities within this sphere.
Thank you. A lot to think about here. The next question we have is from Iram. Iram, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for your just amazing session. Actually, that was very informative and interesting. My question is about tenure times. What about tenure times? For your ideas, how democratic backsliding is affected when tenure times of specifically populists like Orban in Hungary increase? And if it is affected, is it related to they hold nearly all media of the country as populists, or in their hands, or anything else?
So great question. So I think these new populists that have come to power try to extend their tenure in power in two ways, right? So one is a formal legal way through constitutional change. And so that's what's happened, right, in Hungary. So we typically have a classic check on executive power is in a presidential system is a term limit, right? Usually some countries only have one. Those that have had sort of bad experiences with dictators in the past, they say you get one term and then you're out. Most have two. So there's some kind of incentive for good political conduct in power. In presidential systems, what we've seen is a lot of populists have tried to change the constitution. How do they do that? Well, one, if they've mobilized enough popular support and they reach the threshold that's required for a constitutional amendment in their legislatures, right, typically are 2/3, they can pass a constitutional amendment and change term limits. And they may do that legally, right? That's something that's very striking about democratic backsliding. You're hollowing out democracy by using its instruments and tools and institutions. So they go through the process of a constitutional change. Maybe there's bribery of legislators, maybe there's not, but there's a formal constitutional change. So that's one way that can happen. A second way in which they're just hanging on to power, and this, of course, you can see this in parliamentary regimes. There's nothing in a parliamentary regime like Canada, like Britain, like Australia, that stops somebody from being prime minister as long as they keep winning elections, right? So there's only two ways a prime minister loses power in our parliamentary systems if you're in one of these countries. Either your party rebels and wants a different leader, right? Or your party, but if they're happy with you as leader, then as long as you keep winning enough votes to form a parliamentary majority in terms of seats, then you can be prime minister for a long time. So we have Margaret Thatcher, we have Pierre Trudeau, right? There are many different examples we could use. And so I think that is how, but I think in the case of democratic backsliding, what's happening is, again, it's sort of a shifting of the terrain of contestation, right? So you begin to change constitutional rules, you may pass certain laws, you may do it through absolutely legal, fair means, you may do it through corrupt means. But all of it is directed towards keeping this person in power. And another aspect of democratic backsliding is creating a permanent majority, right? Because a classic bargain of democratic competition is free and fair competitions. So that if you lose on this occasion, and maybe even lose the next election, at some point you can win, right? That's what keeps both sides in the game. That's what keeps an opposition loyal. It's loyal to the state and the regime and the constitution, and it's loyal to the bargain because it says at some point we can capture power. What you see with this instance of democratic backsliding is there's more and more leaders and parties that come into power that, like, as I said, do not see their rivals as opponents who are legitimate, but begin to see their rivals as enemies to be destroyed, which is why you see a language of treason, of sedition, right? Or traitors. Just think of what happened in Brexit, things what happens in the US, things what's happening in Hungary, India. If you're an opponent, you're not just an opponent. You're not just a rival who has a legitimate claim to power and representation. You are a rival to be destroyed. You're an enemy. And that is obviously very dangerous for any democracy, because then what you're seeking is a permanent majority in which the other side is a permanent minority and never has access to power. And in terms of the media, the second part of your question, it's absolutely vital to this, right? Because I think there's two aspects I didn't touch on actually. One's very important. If you look at a lot of these new democratically elected strongmen, Trump, Narendra Modi in India, I think are the two classic examples of this. What did they do? Mainstream media that's liberal or progressive or socialist, you don't have to get even to the far left, right? You just liberal media that criticizes them is, sort of condemned as simply they're biased, they're unfair, or worse, they're peddling fake news, right? Mistruths of various kinds. So that's one thing. There's an attack on that media. There's an attack frontally, right, in public, like just disparaging newspapers and journalists and editors who are critical of a leader's action. There are lots of behind the scenes action, and this is less so in the United States, but certainly in places like India, you have many reports of editors being fired, of pressure and intimidation being put on journalists. So you see either people losing their jobs, often being charged with crimes, sometimes crimes to do with what they're doing in terms of the press. Sometimes, and this is where they borrowed a lot from a Chinese playbook, a media organization is hauled into court because of tax improprieties, right? So they get wrangled up and they get caught up in the courts. So one thing that you see a lot happening with these leaders is they're attacking media organizations, which is why, the news today of Maria Ressa winning the Nobel Peace Prize for her platform, for the work she's done on the Rambler, is really important, right? So you have these new digital platforms that are trying to avoid this pressure on the media. But this is what's happening. And the other thing that's happening is this new digital technologies. I didn't mention this, I'll just say this, and it's really important to watch this space. What does Narendra Modi and what does Donald Trump, what do they do? How do they communicate? Well, the media is this intermediary public set of institutions, right? That is both a form of communication under a certain kind of state, right? A form of propaganda. But it has to be, if it's an open free media, that's where you have this contestation and exchange. They circumvent all of that by Twitter, by Facebook, where they have millions of followers, tens of millions of followers who they communicate with through direct, unmediated exchange, right? So you just follow Prime Minister Modi, you just follow President Trump, and that is how they communicate with their supporters, and that's how they mobilize. And that is a novel phenomenon, right? Which is an instrument of power for a lot of these populists. They don't have to rely on sort of capturing the state news media anymore, especially when it turns critical and hostile of them, if it's independent, right? They simply communicate with their supporters and those they want to mobilize to support them through this direct, unmediated exchange. And that's a classic sign of populism. You undermine all intermediary public and political institutions, so that there's a direct communication between the leader and the people. And the leaders seem to represent and embody the aspirations and identity of the people at large.
Thank you. We probably have time for, well, we could have time for one or two more questions. So Philip, did you want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Hi, Sanjay. This is a
Hello.
very insightful discussion. Since I might reformulate my question, since I think some of the parts of my questions have been answered already. But I would just like to manifest that a lot of the things that you have discussed is very concrete here in the Philippines. So I mean, maybe not just on journalists, but actually on us working at human rights NGOs, since we're always named and as enemies publicly by President Duterte. But nonetheless, I think I would like to ask if, for one, what do you think is the role of the privatization of, say, there's this ongoing discussion among us regarding the so-called privatization of the public sphere, because of the ownership, essentially, of social media companies in online. So they regulate and oversee the flow of information and data. At the same time, are there any prospects of populist rhetoric being harnessed, say, for progressive causes? Since I'm actually studying a bit of populism in my presentation here, just to plug it. So I'm looking at it both as a reaction on the disjunctions of the liberal democratic system here in the Philippines, and particularly how it is dramatized in films and television, particularly the disjunctions of the criminal justice system. So I think part of the populist appeal, say, of Duterte has been from in a reaction to the disjunctions, which is a valid, which I think is a valid valid thing to say, or a valid insight. But are there any prospects of that kind of populist rhetoric being mobilized or utilized for more progressive rather than reactionary ends?
Yeah, thank you for your question and basically your criticism, and I absolutely agree with you. And I didn't share that aspect of populism. So I've just focused on the sort of dark side, or the worst version of populism. There is a side of populism. So different ways you can think about populism. A classic distinction is left and right populism. So particularly in post-colonial countries in the global South, we've seen many left-wing populists. And whom do they represent? They represent workers, but particularly the peasantry, right? And sort of classic instance, farmers, those who work in the informal sector. And especially in regimes that are autocratic or, fragile democracies, those populist leaders play a very important role that is progressive at an early stage, I think. Because what they're doing is they're saying that these labor markets, these welfare systems, these political institutions really represent either old interests, right? So the old landowners or the new landowners, the industrial bourgeoisie and capital, the urban middle classes who work in, right, the civil services and so on. And those who form the vast majority of the population, who either work in the agrarian sector or work in informal urban labor markets, who don't have protection, who don't have laws that protect them for, right, all the things we know, who represents them? And so those populists are really important for that, right? So it starts with like sort of Peronism in Argentina, many instances in India, some of the most progressive welfare regimes in India at the state level were these populist leaders. Partha Chatterjee has written really insightfully about this, a critique of exactly the discourse I gave on populism. So again, there's a progressive side to populism, particularly in the South, that we have to look at. And I think even in the North, to be fair, I think a lot of populist leaders that have emerged even in West European democracies, and in this neoliberal era, there's growing inequality. There's a sense that, the state has been captured by certain interests. There's a sense in which the electoral game is rigged. And so that is where you have an attack on independent political institutions and experts, because many are excluded, right? From the sort of prosperity and growth that we've seen in these economies. So the criticism is really well taken. I think the one thing though is that at some point, populism begins to undermine its original aspirational potential, because a classic aspect of populism is to attack the independence and autonomy of institutions. And then that means that it begins to almost undermine its own capacity to deliver, right? So I think that's one thing. And then I think there's another aspect, which is its invocation of a people, which is kind of a homogeneous, right? People begins to attack the aspect of pluralism in our societies, right? And so I think it becomes self-defeating, if not self-destructive, even in countries like the Philippines or India. At some point, begins to undermine and corrode institutions which we need. Privatization of the social media, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what everyone has been struggling with, right? That can these platforms monitor themselves? No. I mean, they want to, but that's because they want to, because they don't want real checks, right? So we see Facebook as like Exhibit A, the elephant in the room, right? It wants to monitor itself. It doesn't come under regulation. Or the regulation is not robust enough. So we see all kinds of terrible things happening on the platform. And as we saw this week in testimony before the US Congress, this whistleblower came out and says, they have obviously a deep incentive not to regulate themselves, because that's how they make their money. They make their money by making sure that stuff that is hazardous to the public sphere is what people keep wanting to read and clicking and sharing. And so in that sense, I think, it's a little bit also like shadow finance, that aspect of the financial world, which is not fully regulated. So there's something kind of similar. That's an interesting sort of area to study in parallel. What's happened in new social media, what's happened in new aspects of the financial markets, in which our regulators, right, the central banks, the supervisory boards, the Fed, they're also having we think of Bitcoin and these new digital currencies, right? They're not fully regulated, and they can create havoc precisely because they're not regulated. And I think in that way, there's an interesting parallel between those two worlds. And so the privatization is part of a piece of this neoliberal era, right? That you privatize many things and you deregulate many aspects of our economy and society. And self-policing is, maybe it's a utopian sort of communitarian ideal, but it's not working.
Thank you. Well, we've come up on the end of our time here, but I want to thank you all for your fantastic questions. If you want to ask any more questions, we do have a discussion board where the video will be posted, so we can pass along those and have a conversation over there as well. Thank you, Sanjay. It was a very fascinating talk, and I'm glad that everyone was eager to ask and discuss a little bit more. So thank you again for your time, and I'm glad we finally got to have this plenary session.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining in your questions.
Thank you all. Have a nice day. We do have another plenary session in about 4 hours, at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So in about 4 hours. We'll see you then. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.